up guys, JTX here. This will be the updated 3.24 bleed bow guide. Now I'll quickly touch on some of the changes to the build, especially with some of the new gems that have come out with automation support and call to arms support. There hasn't been a lot of changes to the build, especially from an early level perspective. If you played the build before, you can rest assured that essentially 99% of the build is still the same all the way until the end game. There is a new end game variation of the build that I do want to talk about. But this, for purposes of a league start video, I'll just cover the basics that have changed, starting with the skill tree. The skill tree itself is largely untouched. The main point is we no longer grab call to arms, so this is now called Warlord's Call. That has been moved on to a gem. So for our Enduring Cry setup we run early game, we want to make sure we actually run the call to arms support gem. So I'll have this in the notes section here. So we have call to arms support with Enduring Cry. It's no longer on the tree. That's the major difference in the tree. We don't have that keystone anymore. Everything else is essentially unchanged with the skill tree. Skill tree you still path the resolute technique as soon as possible, and then you grab more life when you start getting into maps. As for skill gems and leveling, the majority of them are still the same. The only difference is now some of our guard skills have to be put with automation support. This is only if you have enough gem sockets, depending on what you find as you level up. I think you can just get away with manually casting it yourself if you don't want to try tinker around with slotting in an automation support. I'm not really sure how good automation support and how good the uptime is yet, but that's just a quick note that because we can't put guard skills on our left click anymore, it's something to consider just as you're leveling. All the other skill gems still remain the same. You can find all the gems here from your attack skills, your aura skills, and your utility skills, and what act you can get access to them. And then deciding whether or not you want to level with Split Arrow or level with Rain of Arrows. You end up going Split Arrow anyway at Act 8 once you pick up Gratuitous Violence, which are your bleed pops. It just depends what you prefer for leveling. I myself prefer Rain of Arrows because you don't have to aim it, you don't have to run Pierce or Chain or any other sort of clear support skill with it. But it's entirely player preference. That's also the same with movement skills. You can either use Dash, Frostblink. I've used Dash for so long. Arguably, Frostblink is the stronger movement skill because you can hold on to your Snipe puncture channel and still int Frostblink at the same time. Once again, player preference. If you do go Frostblink, make sure you keep it at a low level because the int requirement does scale up with each level you go, and our int doesn't scale that high early on. So make sure you don't over level your gem. Like previous times, this PoB will include leveling trees from 1 all the way into your endgame maps, as well as a cluster gem swap here. If you want to access the different trees, just go down here and tab through them all the way until you get your double cluster set up with all the good stuff at the very end. It also contains different sets of gear, including my own SSF Act 10 test, early mapping, your suppressed gear swap, and your endgame cluster gear swap. I recommend just aiming for early mapping gear. So this is the gear that is realistically obtainable on day 1, day 2 of the league. That's what I would try aim for on day 1 to set yourself up for a really good time going into red maps. Also the skill gem section, same as before. You have different skill gems for different points of your gear progression. We don't have the automation and call to arms support gems yet in PoB, but once they do get added in, I'll make sure to update the actual path of building here. Just note that the build itself is a little bit socket starved. So once you start adding in additional gems like automation, you're gonna have to drop some utility. So potentially where you could drop some of these like gem links, you can probably drop maim on your ensnaring arrow setup to fit in a automation to automate your guard skill if you wish. You could do that for either steel skin or bow molten shell, depending on how much armor you have, if you're running determination or not. Another thing I'd like to touch on as well is with the Transfigured skill gems, you do have access to use Split Arrow of Splitting. I talked about it in my previous videos for my radar, I believe. Split Arrow of Splitting is the trans version of regular Split Arrow. Instead of shooting multiple arrows, it shoots a single arrow that splits into multiple different small arrows. It's almost a little bit like Arrow Nova support. I tested it in Affliction League. Personally, I still like regular Split Arrow with chain. It feels a lot better for clear. It's very hard to scale the number of projectiles with the actual Split Arrow of Splitting. And generally, I found that it was better at killing rares and uniques, but generally worse for clearing. So it's up to you. You can try it out, see what you think. If you do run Split Arrow of Splitting, still the same gem links, but I believe I ran a fork support instead of a chain support. So use fork instead of chain if you do run Split Arrow of Splitting. For Ascendancy choice, obviously we're going Gladiator. You want to pick up Blood in the Eyes first to give you extra chance to bleed while you're leveling, and also Gratuitous Violence as soon as you get to around Act 8. This will make your clear feel really nice. And then picking up Arena Challenger right before on your Merc Lab before you get into maps ideally, and grabbing Outmatch and Outlast last. Now I do want to briefly talk about one of the new techs discovered in Affliction League. That's to do with the Ralakesh's Impatience Boots and Diolessa's Delight Belt from Maven, the interaction that they have. Basically, it's a really, really powerful interaction because Ralakesh's Boots always counts you as having your maximum endurance frenzy power charges, whilst Olessa's Belt converts your frenzy charges into something called Affliction Charges. Affliction Charges give you 8% more DOT damage per charge you have, but you also get to maintain the effects of Frenzy because technically you don't have the Frenzy Charges with Ralakesh's Boots, but you count as having them. So with this new combination, you can potentially go for a Frenzy Charge stacking build, and I'll have a tree for that in this POB as well, where you stack as many Frenzy Charges as possible. And then you also grab Masterful Form here from the Slayer Ascendancy with your Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh. So you get additional endurance charges as well that are equal to your Frenzy charges. I think this is a really, really powerful way of building bleed in the end game, but this is very dependent on the price of the boots, as well as availability of the specific Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh that you need. Normally you just go for Champion's Fortitude, which is amazing for the build, just 20 flat Fortify, which is always great to have. But that's just something to consider if you do want to push the build into the hyper end game. I recommend using the Ralakesh plus Olessa's tech. The only nerf that it's gotten is the Ralakesh has lost the 30% movement speed. Obviously that kind of sucks a little bit, but we're still very, very fast with our calendar charges. And also if we spec our tree for frenzy charges, we get movement speed from frenzy. You still feel pretty darn fast. And once again, I feel like I give this disclaimer every single league. If you are playing Bleed Bow Gladiator, you will be using a Snipe and Puncture setup. Different players have different feelings about Puncture and Snipe. Just note that Snipe is a channeling skill that locks you into place while you channel up your shot to shoot. Some players get used to it, some players don't. That's something to consider when you play this build. Generally, I think it's okay because you don't need to puncture that many times. Normally once or twice is enough for most bosses in the game. You have a high consistency damage uptime compared to other builds. Volatility also obviously makes it better that you shoot more punctures in the shorter time frame to try to fish for a higher bleed. That's also amplified by Mustafa's Coil. Fun fact is, there hasn't been a belt that's better than Mustafa's Coil until last league, which is the Olessa's Delight, which is the tech combined with Ralakesh, which is why I like those items so much. Another cool change for this league are tattoos are back from the Total League. Now, if you didn't play Trial of the Ancestors, tattoos are special currency items that you can apply to your passive tree on your stat nodes or travel nodes to actually replace it with a different effect. So for normal stat nodes, this gives plus 10 dexterity or plus 10 strength. If you put a tattoo onto it, it changes the effect. Now, for example, we can add chance to suppress spell damage. We know this is one of the ones that have been kept in the game. So if you're having a hard time finishing your suppression on capping your suppressor on your gear, you can also get tattoos on your tree. You can get life, extra stats, resistances, suppress, whatever that has carried across from Toda, you can just pretty much tattoo your tree to get a lot of extra value. Now, you can also combine this with the node Supreme Ostentation, which means you ignore attribute requirements for all your gear. This pretty much allows you to fully tattoo your entire tree, so your entire tree can be tattooed. So all your stat nodes can be tattoos instead, so you can get a crazy amount of value from your tree. Now, this is just one of the cool things with tattoos coming back. Something to consider if you do want to try out the build. You can go Supreme Ostentation and go crazy with tattoos. I'll quickly talk about the pros and cons of the build if it is your first time trying out the build. The pros for this build are that it's an extremely fast build with calendar charges and also the Gladiator Bleed Pops. It's incredibly good at mapping, and it's also no slouch when it comes to doing single target damage either. Your Puncture Snipe damage easily reaches maybe 2 or 3 million just on very bare bones gear, and 2 or 3 million DOT damage. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually equivalent to a much higher like on hit DPS, because on hit DPS has to consider your damage isn't always up. The gear itself is fairly easy to get. It's all rare gear. There's no mandatory uniques that you have to get. Obviously, getting a Risata's Coil is really powerful for the build, but it's not needed early on. The main thing you want to focus on is getting a high fizz DPS bow. But other than that, the gearing is very, very flexible in how you want to do it. The cons for the build are obviously the playstyle. You're using a channeling skill, so not everyone's used to it. Having to stay in one place to shoot a target can be very dangerous because you don't want to stand still in a game like Path of Exile. The gear requirements for this build are a little bit higher than some spell-based builds or minion builds or just other general like generic S tier league starter builds. That's just mainly the fact that our build scales a lot better with getting a good weapon. That's just something to consider. Your gear is important when you go into the early game. You can't get away with absolutely trash gear. The last downside I can potentially think of is obviously this build's not the tankiest in the world. We do run determination. We have our guard skills. We're not like the physical to elemental converting damage build with like lightning coil, taste of hate. We can run those as an option as well, but that's not something we normally do. Just keeping that in mind, the build isn't like a glass cannon, but it's not obviously going to be as tanky as some other builds out there. So something to consider when you play this build. You will be trading off some of your defenses for a lot more damage and speed. Early uniques you can consider. You can go for a mark of submission with a vulnerability socketed in if you want a curse on hit vulnerability early on. Obviously, you switch that to a actual proper curse on hit ring when those actually start appearing on the market. You can also go the alternate quality scaling route. So you can go for Ashes of the Stars and the Dialis Malefaction. Puncture gets more damage with quality. That's also an option. Personally, I don't feel like it's worth sacrificing your suppress and your armor and your defense to get that little bit of extra damage. Normally, you'll be able to cap your damage through normal means anyway without having to go quality scaling. There's also another variation of the build that uses Adorned and the jewel stacking. That's obviously very like hyper endgame and not something I'd cover in a league start video, but I'm just trying to make people aware that there are a few ways to build out the lead bow in the endgame. You can do it the way that I have here, which is the conventional endgame, and that's worked for the last 3-4 leagues. I don't see why it would be any different for this league. And my personal recommendation is try build it as the frenzy charge stacking one if you do have enough currency and if the boots are accessible. That would be my personal recommendation. I haven't tried the Adorned scaling version myself, but I think that also has very high potential. All in all, I think this build will be fantastic for Necropolis League. I really think it will perform well with the built-in bleed explosions. Having a source of explode has always been good against all forms of content. If you are running this build and you want my personal recommendation for content, I do like running Expedition, Legion, Breach on this type of build. It's really good at clearing high density packs of mobs. Just make sure that you do have enough defense. So if you feel like you're dying too much in maps or you feel like there's things are hitting really hard, make sure you have your determination plus molten shell setup in place. Make sure you have a good amount of armor / evasion on your gear, and make sure you have your suppression capped. All those things will take you a very long way in the build. I'm looking forward to the league start. If you guys do want to ask any questions or do want to tune in, I will be live streaming the whole entire league start at twitch.tv/JTX. If you have any questions about the build or just want to say hi, be sure to stop in. I love chatting with you guys, and hopefully everyone has a really good league start. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will catch you guys in the next one.